The wind carried the smell of dust and dry sagebrush across the open plains, rattling against the broken boards of a once proud homestead. A thin figure stood at its porch, her frame frail against the backdrop of the setting sun. Her dress, once light blue, now hung in faded tatters. It seemed stretched and mended too many times to count. The woman pressed a hand against her hollow stomach, the ache inside her body gnawing worse than the call of coyotes that echoed at night. She had gone 2 days without a real meal, and the small patch of garden she once tended was nothing more than withered stalks under the merciless summer sky. Hunger had a way of humbling even the proud, and desperation now pushed her down a road she never imagined she would walk. Far in the distance stood the rancher's land, acres upon acres of green pastures fenced strong, where cattle grazed and horses moved like shadows in the evening light. The sight of it brought both hope and shame to her heart. She had heard of him, the man who worked the ranch with an iron will, a figure folks in town spoke of in hushed tones. Some said he was hard as flint, others whispered he had a quiet kindness hidden beneath the sternness carved into his face. She had never dared approach him before, but hunger changes a soul. Tonight, she had no choice but to swallow what little pride she had left and step toward that land. Her boots scuffed against the dirt path, each step heavy, not from the miles but from the weight of her decision. She thought of her baby, lying in a thin blanket back in the shack, cheeks sunken and cries weaker each day. The child was the last piece of her husband's memory, a man taken too soon by fever and buried under the oak behind the house. She had promised him she would keep their little one safe, no matter the cost. But promises were easy when life still offered mercy. Now survival itself demanded bargains she had never thought she would make. The sound of hooves made her freeze. From the curve of the trail came a rider, tall in the saddle, broad shoulders squared under a worn coat. The horse slowed as it neared her, and she lifted her gaze. It was him, the rancher. The man's face was half shadowed by his hat, but his eyes held the kind of steady look that made a person forget words. He reined his horse close and studied her without speaking, and she felt her throat tighten. Her voice came out rough, broken, from thirst and nerves. "Can I babysit your baby for some food?" The words tumbled from her lips before she could shape them gentler, the plea raw and sharp in the dry evening air. She had heard whispers that the rancher had a small child of his own, left in the care of hired help since his wife had passed. She didn't know if the rumor was true, but the thought had planted itself deep enough that it now became her last hope. For a long moment, the rancher did not reply. His eyes flicked over her worn dress, her trembling hands, the thinness of her frame. The silence between them grew heavy, like the stillness before a storm. She could feel her own heartbeat racing, afraid of what his answer might be, yet unable to take the words back. The man finally leaned forward in the saddle, his voice low, steady, carrying the weight of someone used to giving orders and expecting them to be followed. "You're standing on my land asking for food in exchange for work. That much I understand." His tone was neither cruel nor kind, but something in between, unreadable. But why a baby? Why not offer to mend clothes, clean the house, or tend the stock? Her lips parted, but the words tangled in her throat. She had thought only of what she could give her own care, the only skill she trusted most, the instinct sharpened by nights of rocking her little one to sleep through hunger. Her eyes watered as she tried to answer, and she hated herself for the tears, because I know how to hold a baby close. I know how to keep them warm when the night bites cold. I know how to hush their cries, even when there's no milk to give. It's all I have to offer. The rancher's jaw tightened as if weighing her words against something deep inside his mind. The wind picked up again, lifting dust around them, carrying the distant call of a coyote. She felt the weight of his gaze linger on her face, not with pity, but with something harder to name. The sun dipped lower, painting the horizon with streaks of red and gold. She stood trembling in its glow, waiting, her hunger clawing inside her and her heart beating like a drum. His silence stretched on, a rope pulling tighter with every second. Would he turn her away? Would he laugh at her desperate bargain? Or would he test her, perhaps even lead her toward more than she had dared hope for? The rancher finally shifted in his saddle, eyes narrowing as though he had reached some decision. Yet before he spoke, the distant cry of a child broke through the air, drifting from the direction of his ranch. The sound was faint but unmistakable. The widow's breath caught, her body stiffening, hope and fear colliding inside her chest. He turned his horse slightly, the leather reins creaking under his grip, but his eyes never left hers. "If you truly mean what you say, then follow me," he said. His voice carried no warmth, yet beneath it lay something that made her knees weak, a possibility, a chance at saving her child. But as he nudged his horse forward, he added in tone that cut like a blade, "Just know, ma'am, I don't take kindly to lies or half-hearted bargains. If you step foot on my ranch, you best be ready to prove every word you just spoke." Her heart pounded. She stood frozen for a breath, staring at the man's back as he rode slowly toward the horizon. Behind her lay emptiness and certain hunger. Ahead, his land and a risk she couldn't measure. She tightened her shawl around her shoulders and took a step forward, then another, the dirt crunching beneath her boots. The sound of the baby's cry still lingered in the distance, pulling her onward. She followed, uncertain of what awaited her beyond the fence line, but knowing there was no turning back. The sky darkened, the first stars pricking through the deepening blue. The path stretched before her, and with each step, the questions grew heavier in her mind. Would he truly let her stay? Would he keep his word, or cast her out after testing her limits? And whose cry had she heard at the ranch? Was it real? Or just a cruel echo of her own starving child waiting back home? Her feet carried her forward, but inside her heart, the answers remained hidden, waiting to unfold with the night. The dirt road leading toward the ranch seemed longer than she remembered. Each step felt heavier, though she knew it wasn't just her weary legs or empty stomach. It was the weight of not knowing what she was walking into. The rancher's horse trotted a few paces ahead, his broad back straight and steady. He didn't glance over his shoulder, not once, as if he already knew she would follow. That steadiness unsettled her almost as much as it comforted her. Men like him didn't give anything away for free, not even a look. She kept her eyes fixed on the ground, watching her boots scuff against the dust. A part of her wanted to run back to the shack, to gather her baby and shut the world out, to fight hunger and silence as she had been. But another part, the part that heard the faint cry drifting from his land, pulled her forward. If that child was real, if he truly needed someone to watch over it, then maybe she had stumbled on a way to keep her own baby alive. Yet fear lingered, whispering questions she didn't dare answer. By the time the rancher slowed his horse near the gate, the sky was deepening into shades of purple. A single lantern flickered by the barn, casting long shadows across the yard. The ranch stretched wide, its fences running straight and strong, the house itself standing tall against the horizon. It was everything her place wasn't kept solid, alive. She paused at the gate, her hands trembling against the worn wood. While he dismounted and tied his horse to the post, he finally looked back at her, his face unreadable in the dim light. "You said you could care for a baby. That's no small claim." His tone was firm, but not cruel. He studied her again as though weighing whether she meant every word she had spoken on the road. She wanted to answer quickly, to assure him she was true, but something in his gaze stopped her. It was as though he wasn't only asking if she could tend a child, he was asking if she could endure whatever might come with the task. Before she could find the words, A sharp wail broke the stillness. From the window of the house, the sound of a crying infant carried through the night air. She stiffened, her heart lurching in her chest. The cry was real, piercing, and full of need. She felt her legs move on their own, carrying her a step closer to the house before she caught herself. The rancher's eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, but in calculation. "You hear that?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. She nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. "That's mine," he said, his voice low. "Boy's been restless since sundown. I've got hands who can mend fences and drive cattle, but not one of them knows what to do with a babe. His is." Words struck her like a hammer. The rumor had been true. He did have a child. She felt both relief and fear mingle inside her. Relief that she hadn't made a fool of herself with her plea. Fear because the door was now cracked open, and she would have to step fully through. She thought of her own baby back in the shack, small chest rising and falling in weak sleep, and for the first time she wondered if she had done right by leaving him behind even for this short time. The choice tore at her, but she pushed it down. If she could earn food here, if she could secure even a little milk or bread, then the sacrifice of leaving him for these hours would be worth it. The rancher motioned toward the house. "Come along then. If you mean what you said, tonight will. Tell me." Her knees threatened to buckle as she followed him to the porch. The door creaked open and warm lamplight spilled out, illuminating a room that smelled faintly of wood smoke and fresh bread. Her stomach twisted painfully at the scent, but she forced herself to look instead toward the cradle tucked near the kinzim hearth. The baby inside kicked against a thin blanket, tiny fists flailing as the cries grew sharper. She crossed the room before the rancher could speak, her instincts pulling her forward. Her hands, though trembling, grew steadier as she lifted the child into her arms. The baby's face was flushed, little mouth wide with hungry cries. She pressed him gently against her shoulder, swaying lightly, humming a tune she had once used on long nights back at her shack. Slowly, the wailing softened to whimpers, then to tiny hiccups. The room fell quiet except for the soft crackle of the fire. When she dared glance up, the rancher was watching her, his hat still in his hand, his eyes fixed on the scene as though trying to measure something he couldn't quite name. His face remained stern, but his silence told her enough. He had seen her do what his ranch hands could not. She lowered her gaze back to the baby, rocking him gently, feeling the weight of his small body against her chest. For the first time in days, something inside her loosened. She knew she could keep this little one calm. She knew she could be useful here. But she also knew the test had only begun. The rancher finally spoke, his voice quiet but edged with warning. A baby can be calmed for a moment, but the real question is whether you can keep him safe, fed, and warm night after night. I don't take chances with blood of my own. His words sent a shiver down her spine. She nodded, her voice low but steady. I can. He studied her again, as if trying to read the truth in her face. Then he set his hat on the table and leaned against the wall. You'll stay tonight. We'll see if you're worth the food you're asking for. Her breath caught, half relief, half dread. Stay tonight. The words were both a gift and a trial. Her mind flashed to her own baby back at the shack, alone under the thin blanket. The thought tore at her, but the hunger clawing her ribs reminded her why she had come. If she could endure tonight, if she could prove herself, then tomorrow might bring bread, milk, maybe even a chance at survival for both her and her child. She rocked the rancher's baby in the lamplight, listening to the quiet rhythm of his breath as he drifted to sleep. The house around her was warm, solid, safe. Yet inside her heart, a storm gathered. She had stepped into a world far larger than her own, under the gaze of a man whose trust was harder to win than the land itself. And as the fire crackled in shadows, shifted across the walls. She could not shake the gnawing thought, would she be able to serve both children, or would the price of survival demand a choice she wasn't ready to make? The night stretched before her, heavy with silence, the weight of her promise pressing harder with each tick of the clock. Somewhere outside, the coyotes howled again, and the rancher's eyes lingered on her like a watchman at the gate of fate. The questions hung unspoken in the air, thick and unyielding, waiting for dawn to bring answers she feared she might not want to hear. The night pressed heavy around the ranch house, the wind scraping along the wooden walls like a restless hand. Inside, the firelight threw long shadows across the floor where the widow sat with the baby still resting against her chest. The little boy had finally drifted into a deep sleep, his tiny breath soft against her collarbone. Her arms ached from holding him so long, but she dared not put him down, not when the warmth of his body reminded her of the small child she had left behind in her shack. Every rise and fall of his breath echoed like a promise she wasn't sure she could keep. The rancher moved about the room in silence, his boots heavy against the wooden boards. Now and then he glanced toward her, as if making sure she wouldn't falter. He didn't speak, not yet, and she wondered what thoughts turned behind those sharp eyes. He poured himself a tin cup of coffee and leaned against the table, watching her with a kind of stillness that made her skin prickle. "You took to him fast," he said finally, his tone even, though not without a trace of surprise. "Most folks don't know what to do when a baby cries like that. You handled him as if you've done it 1,000 times." Her voice cracked softly, but she forced steadiness into it. "I have. My own child. He cries the same when hunger bites. The rockin' helps, even if it don't fill the stomach." She lowered her eyes, ashamed at the truth slipping free. The rancher didn't answer at once. The only sound was the steady tick of the old clock on the mantel. After a long pause, he set his cup down with a quiet thud. "You left a baby alone in your home?" His words were not cruel, but the edge in them stung her all the same. Tears threatened, but she held them back. "I had no choice. If I didn't come here, we'd both starve. He's weak, but he sleeps deep. I promised I'd come back with food." The silence after her confession seemed to stretch forever. The rancher's face was unreadable, yet his eyes lingered on hers long enough that she had to look away. She clutched his child tighter, the fear in her chest fighting against the desperate hope that had driven her here, outside. The coyotes called again, their howls carried on the wind like mournful voices. She thought of her shack, the thin walls, the lonely crib with its tiny occupant. Her chest ached with the thought of the baby stirring in the night, searching for comfort she could not give from here. The rancher finally spoke, his voice quiet but firm. "Tomorrow you'll fetch your child. No babe should be left alone in the dark. If you're to work here, you'll keep him under this roof where I can see him." Her head snapped up, shock flooding through her. She searched his face for signs of mockery, but found none. The words left her breathless. To bring her baby here, under this roof, meant both safety and risk. She had no choice but to accept, but his offer carried another weight, one that pressed against her chest. If she stepped fully into his house, she would no longer belong only to her own life of solitude. She would be part of his world, a place filled with eyes watching, measuring, testing. She had already seen how his gaze carried judgment sharper than any blade. To live under it each day would be a trial she wasn't sure she could endure. Fire popped loudly, breaking her thoughts. She shifted the child gently, laying him back into his cradle. The rancher watched her every move, silent, careful. When the baby stirred but didn't wake, she let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding. He straightened then, crossing his arms. "There's more to life here than rocking a cradle. This land doesn't forgive weakness. If you're to stay, you'll work, same as anyone." The men out in the bunkhouse won't think much of me keeping another mouth fed without reason. She bristled at the thought, though fear kept her shoulders from squaring. I can work. I've tilled ground, mended clothes, gathered wood. I'm not afraid of labor. His gaze softened only a fraction, but it was enough to stir something uncertain in her chest. We'll see, he said simply. The night stretched on with the rancher finally retreating to his room, leaving her by the fire. She curled on a chair, pulling the shawl tighter around her thin frame. Sleep came fitfully, filled with dreams of crying babies and endless fields of dust. When dawn broke, the ranch bustled with noise she hadn't heard in years. Men shouted across the yard, hooves clattered on hard ground. The clang of metal against wood carried sharp through the morning air. She stepped onto the porch, the chill of the air biting her skin, and watched as the ranch hands moved with quick precision. Some glanced her way, curiosity flashing in their eyes, but none stopped their work. She felt their stares all the same. As if each one questioned why she was there. The rancher strode out from the barn, his step sure, his voice cutting through the yard with authority. He barked orders the men obeyed without hesitation, and she realized just how much weight his word carried. He spotted her on the porch but didn't slow, only nodded once before moving on. That single gesture was enough to make her heart race. Though she wasn't sure if from fear or something she dared not name. By mid-morning, he returned, his face set with decision. We'll ride to your place. Bring your child here, as I said. But know this, once you cross back, you may not return. To live in that shack. This ranch is harsh, but it's strong. Out there, you're on your own, and I don't see you lasting much longer. The words, though spoken plain, cut deep. She nodded, fighting the urge to argue. She couldn't risk losing this chance. They set out together, his horse carrying him ahead while she walked the path back to her homestead. The closer she drew, the more dread coiled in her stomach. What if something had happened in the night? What if she found silence where she prayed to hear a cry? She hurried the last stretch, her breath ragged. Until the shack came into view, her heart nearly stopped when she pushed open the door. The small bundle on the cot shifted, a weak cry filling the air. Relief nearly dropped her to her knees. She rushed forward, scooping her baby into her arms, pressing his tiny frame tight against her chest. His skin was cool, his body lighter than it should be, but he was alive. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she kissed his forehead, whispering apologies. Over and over, the rancher stood at the doorway, silent, watching her cradle her child with a look she couldn't decipher. He let her have that moment, then finally spoke. Bring him. He'll be safer under my roof. She looked around the shack one last time. The walls, the broken furniture, the patch of earth outside, it was all she had known since her husband's death, but the hunger etched into the boards reminded her why she couldn't stay. She tightened the blanket around her baby and stepped past the threshold, leaving behind the ghost of her old life. As they walked back toward the ranch, the weight of her choice settled heavy. She was stepping into a place of power, ruled by a man she didn't yet understand, with strangers who might see her as nothing more than a burden. And yet, she carried her baby closer, knowing she had no other path left. When they returned, the men at the ranch watched openly now, their eyes flicking from her to the child in her arms. Whispers followed, low and curious. She kept her head down, but she felt the judgment like stones against her back. The ranchers silenced them with a glance, and the whispers died as quickly as they began. That night, as she laid both babies to sleep, his and hers side by side, the truth of her situation sank in deeper. She was no longer just a starving widow. On the edge of land forgotten by God, she was now part of something larger, a life bound by rules she hadn't yet learned. Under the gaze of a man whose trust could either save her or break her, the fire burned low, shadows deepening across the Timan room. She listened to the soft breaths of the children and the steady steps of the rancher pacing outside. Every sound carried both safety and threat. She wondered what tomorrow would bring, what tests still waited, and whether the choices she had made would keep her and her child alive or trap her in a life she could never escape. The answers remained hidden in the night, as heavy and silent as the land itself. The days that followed blurred together in a rhythm she had never known before. Morning began before the sun had fully crested the hills, with the cries of both babies pulling her from what little sleep she managed. Her own child clung weakly to her breast, though she had little milk left to give, while the rancher's boy fussed until she rocked him near the hearth. By the time the men were saddling their horses, her arms were already sore from carrying and calming the little ones. Yet there was no pause, for the rancher expected more than soft hands. He set her to tasks around the house, repairing torn linens, sweeping the floors, hauling water from the pump. Her back ached and her head swam with hunger, but she refused to show weakness. She caught the eyes of the ranch hands now and then, men leaning on their shovels or pausing at the corral fence, whispering among themselves as she moved about. Their looks carried a weight she couldn't ignore. Some were curious, others skeptical, a few carrying the edge of scorn. She knew what they must be thinking, a starving widow given shelter by their hard master, trusted with his child. That alone was enough to stir questions. The rancher himself spoke little. He rose early, worked alongside his men, and returned at dusk with the air of someone carrying the burden of land and beasts alike. When he did address her, his words were plain, almost clipped, but his eyes searched her as if trying to catch a falter. Each time, she met his gaze steady, though her heart hammered inside. She could not afford to fail, not when the safety of her child hung by the thread of his judgment. Yet even as the days stretched, she noticed the unease growing within the ranch. The cattle had grown restless, bellowing louder than usual at night. The men muttered about rustlers seen near the ridge, shadows slipping across the land under cover of darkness. Fences were found cut, and once a calf had gone missing. Whispers turned sharp, and the air on the ranch grew tense. She overheard them one evening. The men gathered near the barn after supper. "Don't sit right," one said, spitting into the dirt. Trouble started near the same time she showed up. His voice carried a note that made her blood run cold. Another grunted. Could be coincidence. Could be she's tied to someone watching. Hungry widow shows up on the doorstep asking for food. Maybe she's a signal, drawing eyes where they don't belong. Her chest tightened as she clutched her baby close, hidden just inside the doorway. She wanted to step out, to shout at them that they were wrong, that all she wanted was bread and safety for her child. But fear held her tongue, for she knew one word in the wrong ear could end everything. Later that night, when the babies finally slept, she sat by the fire and tried to steady her breath. The rancher came in, dust clinging to his coat, his expression harder than usual. He studied her a long moment before speaking. "There are men watching this land. My hands are restless, thinking on what's been lost. They talk more than they work, and talk breeds suspicion." She lowered her gaze, shame pricking her skin, though she had done nothing wrong. "I heard them," she admitted quietly. "They think I'm part of it." His voice dropped lower, sharp as a blade. "And are you?" The question cut deeper than the whispers. She lifted her head, her eyes burning with the force of her denial. "No, I've nothing but this child in my arms. And hunger in my belly. I don't know anything about men cutting fences or stealing stock." For a moment, the silence between them felt like a trial. He watched her face, as if reading every line, every flicker of fear. At last he gave a short nod, but his words carried no comfort. "You'd best pray the others believe the same, or this house won't be safe for you much longer." Her sleep that night was broken, haunted by dreams of men with torches, of cries in the dark, of her child slipping from her arms. When dawn came, her eyes were heavy, but the work did not wait. Days stretched further. The tension on the ranch wound tighter with each sunrise. The missing cattle grew in number, and the men rode out at night to guard the fences. Gunfire cracked once in the distance, and though no one spoke of it the next morning, the fear lingered heavy. She kept to her duties, tending to the babies, sewing torn shirts for the men when asked, but the whispers did not fade. Her own child grew thinner. Despite the scraps of food she managed, the rancher had allowed her meals at his table, though small and always under the eyes of the men. Each bite she took felt like both mercy and trial, as if she were being measured for how much she deserved. She tried to save pieces for her baby, soft bread soaked in milk, but it was never enough. Still, she clung to the hope that surviving each day meant another chance to prove her worth. One evening, as the sun bled red across the horizon, the rancher returned earlier than usual. His face was set, harder than she had ever seen, his eyes storm-dark. He strode into the house, his boots striking sharp against the floor. She stiffened, clutching the babies close. "There's talk in town," he said flatly. "They say a band of rustlers has been moving north, taking stock and leaving little behind. Some of the men here believe one of their own is feeding them word, and others," his gaze landed heavy on her, "others believe you're the one." Her breath caught, her throat tightening. "That's not true. I swear it." He stepped closer, the heat of his presence pressing against her like a wall. "I want to believe you. But belief doesn't keep cattle in the field or men loyal. I've kept you here, given you food, shelter. If you've lied, it will cost more than just your place in this house." Her hands shook as she held the children tighter. "I've told no lies. All I want is for them to live. That's all." The rancher's jaw clenched, his eyes narrowing as though torn between doubt and faith. "Then prove it," he said finally, his voice low and sharp. "When the time comes, you'll show where you stand. Words won't be enough." Her heart pounded with a fear she couldn't shake. She didn't know when or how this test would come, only that it would. The days ahead felt like walking a tight rope above a pit, one misstep away from ruin. That night, as the wind howled and the fire burned low, she sat awake with the children in her arms, her eyes fixed on the door. She could hear the restless movement of men outside, voices carried faint on the wind. The rancher's warning echoed in her ears and dread coiled in her chest. Somewhere in the dark, trouble was gathering, and she knew it would soon strike. The land itself seemed to hold its breath in the days that followed. The cattle refused to settle, the horses spooked at shadows, and the men grew sharper in their words. She worked harder, desperate to prove her place, but the unease only grew. Each night she listened for the crack of gunfire, the rush of hooves, the sound of chaos at the gates. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, a rider came fast from the ridge. His horse foamed at the mouth, his face pale with urgency. The men gathered as he shouted, "They're coming! Rustlers! Dozens of them!" The yard erupted into chaos, men running for rifles, horses saddled in haste. The rancher strode through the center, his voice cutting through the noise with command. Yet his eyes, sharp as ever, sought hers before he mounted his horse. "Keep them safe," he said, nodding toward the children. His tone carried both trust and warning, heavy enough to crush her chest. As he rode off with his men, the thunder of hooves shaking the ground, she stood frozen in the doorway, clutching the babies tight. The night ahead promised fire and blood, and she knew the moment of proving had come. The wind whipped cold against her skin as she closed the door, bolting it with trembling hands. The children stirred, sensing her fear, their cries rising into the air. She pressed them close, heart racing, every sound outside magnified into a threat. The clash between survival and suspicion had reached its edge. The walls around her shook with the weight of an unseen storm, and she knew the night would not pass without testing every word she had spoken. Somewhere beyond the hills, gunfire cracked, and the echoes carried back to the ranch like a warning. She stood in the flicker of the firelight, the children wailing in her arms, waiting for the storm to break against the door. The gunfire outside cracked like thunder, each shot tearing through the night and settling deep into her bones. She clutched both children close, rocking them as much to calm herself as to soothe their frightened cries. The house trembled beneath the weight of the storm outside. Shouts rose and fell, hooves pounded against the earth, and the smell of smoke drifted faintly through the cracks in the wood. Her heart raced as she pressed her ear to the door, straining to hear which way the battle was turning. Every second felt like a lifetime. At last, the sound of hooves drew near, louder and faster, until they circled the ranch yard. She held her breath, praying it was the rancher and his men returning. A shadow passed the window, then another, but the voices were harsh and unfamiliar. She knew with a sick twist of fear that some of the rustlers had broken through. Her arms tightened around the children as she backed away from the door, every muscle braced for what might come crashing in. The latch rattled once, twice, then fell still. Whoever it was had moved on, perhaps toward the barn or the stores of feed and grain. Relief washed over her, but it was thin and fleeting. The danger was not gone, only shifted. She paced the floor in silence, whispering prayers under her breath, her eyes flicking again and again toward the cradle and the fire that had nearly burned to embers. Time blurred, filled only with the echoes of chaos outside. Then, slowly, the gunfire eased. The shouts grew fewer, fainter. The air itself seemed to sag with exhaustion. At last the sound of hooves thundered back into the yard, and this time she knew by the steady rhythm that it was the rancher and his men. She hurried to unbolt the door, stepping into the porch light with both babies still pressed to her chest. The rancher dismounted, his hat low, his coat torn at the sleeve. His face was streaked with dust and sweat, but his eyes burned sharp in the glow of the lanterns. He scanned the yard quickly, barking orders to his men before turning toward her. For a moment, his gaze softened, and she felt her knees nearly buckle with relief. "It's done," he said, his voice hoarse but steady. "They won't trouble this ranch again." The words should have eased her heart, yet they carried weight too. Done did not mean finished for her. She knew questions still lingered among the men, doubts planted deep that would not vanish overnight. Still, she stepped forward, lifting her chin though her arms trembled. "I kept them safe, just like you told me." He studied her a long moment, his eyes flicking from her face to the small heads resting against her shoulder. Then, with a quiet nod, he said, "You did." The days that followed were filled with weariness and slow recovery. The rustlers had taken stock, left broken fences, and spilled blood on the edge of the land. But the ranch still stood, and so did its master. The men, once restless and doubtful, worked with renewed urgency, driven by the near loss of all they've had. And through it all, the widow moved among them with her child at her side, tending to the house, feeding the babies, stitching wounds where needed. The whispers that once followed her began to fade. She noticed at first when one of the ranch hands accepted bread from her without hesitation, then later when another asked her to mend a shirt. Small gestures, but they carried more weight than words. The suspicion that had once clung to her began to loosen, though she knew it would never vanish completely. Still, each day she rose before the sun, and each night she laid both babies to rest, grateful that the ranch had not cast her out. The rancher himself grew quieter in those days, though his eyes often lingered on her when he thought she did not notice. He spoke to her less like a stranger and more like a partner in the life of the ranch. When a task needed doing, he asked instead of commanded. When the children cried, He no longer hesitated to place his son in her arms, trusting she could soothe him. And once, after a long day of mending fences, he paused in the doorway and said simply, "You've kept your word." Those 4 words carried more weight than any praise she had ever known. Her own child grew stronger in the weeks that followed. With steady meals and a roof that held firm against the wind, his cheeks filled out, his cries grew louder, his eyes brighter. She would catch herself staring at him as he slept, marveling at how quickly life had returned to his small frame. More than once she pressed her lips to his forehead and whispered thanks into the stillness for the chance to keep him here, alive. The rancher's boy thrived as well. The 2 babies often laid side by side, reaching clumsy hands toward each other in the cradle. Watching them, she felt a strange mixture of fear and hope. Their lives were tied together now, and she wondered what paths might open before them. She knew only that she would fight to keep them both safe, no matter what it cost. As the season shifted, the land itself seemed to breathe easier. The grass pushed green again across the hills. The cattle settled into calmer rhythms, and the men worked with a steadiness that spoke of healing. One evening, as the sun bled gold across the horizon, she stepped onto the porch with both children in her arms. The rancher stood nearby, his figure strong against the fading light, his eyes fixed on the land that stretched wide and endless. He glanced at her, his face unreadable at first, then softened. "You've done more than you promised. You didn't just keep them safe. You've steadied this house." Her breath caught, her throat tightening with the swell of emotion she had held back for so long. "I only did what I had to. For them. For survival." He shook his head slightly, his gaze lingering. "Survival alone doesn't bring strength. You've given more than that." The words settled deep, though she had no answer for them. She turned her eyes instead toward the children, their faces glowing in the last light of day. The silence stretched between her and the rancher, not heavy this time, but full, as if both knew that something unspoken had begun to take root. As night fell, she returned inside, laying both babies down in their cradle. She watched them for a long moment, their breath steady, their small bodies safe beneath the roof of a house she had once entered trembling with fear. She thought of the path that had led her here, the hunger, the whispers, the storm of suspicion. And danger. All of it had brought her to this moment, where survival had turned into something stronger, something steadier. She knew the future still carried its share of trials. The land was harsh, the work endless, and the memories of hunger would never fully fade. But she also knew that she was no longer alone. She had stepped into a world that had tested her, measured her, and at last allowed her to stand. The fire crackled softly as she drew the shawl tighter around her shoulders. She sat near the cradle, listening to the steady rhythm of the children's breaths, the sound of the ranch settling quiet for the night, and the faint step of the rancher outside. For the first time in longer than she could remember, she felt a peace that was not fragile but firm. And so the story of a starving widow who had begged for food ended not with despair, but with a hard-won place in the heart of a land that demanded everything. She had come seeking survival and found it, but she had also found something else, the strength to belong, to protect, to endure. As the night deepened and the stars rose high, she closed her eyes, whispering a final vow to the children before sleep claimed her. Whatever storms might come, whatever whispers might return, she would face them with the same fire that had carried her here. For she had proven herself, not only to the rancher, not only to the men, but to the land itself. And in that quiet truth, her journey found its end.